Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. This is Brother Ijaz Ahmed of Calling Christians and MAP, the Muslim Apologetics Podcast. Back in March of 2018, just a few months ago, I had a dialogue with J. Smith, and at the 1st of August, he released a new video basically summarizing his previous videos on his new YouTube channel. What I've noticed in his new video is that he's begun to walk back claims or correct himself based on the dialogue I had with him. But he continues to make really big mistakes, and today I'll just highlight a few of them based on his latest video.
More than that, he had a secretary named Zaid ibn Thabit. Why didn't he write it down? Isn't that what secretaries are supposed to do? These are all the questions we brought up, and of course we asked them in the second episode.
Well, Jay, allow me to answer this question for you. I'm reading from the book published by Darussalam. It's titled The Biography of Imam Zaid ibn Thabit, and it is written by Salahuddin Ali Abdul Mawjud. On page 66, it is written, Walid ibn Abu Walid reported that Sulaiman ibn Kharija ibn Zaid narrated from his father on the authority of his grandfather, who said, whenever the revelation came to Allah's messenger, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, he would send for me and I would write it down. So in this narration, this is Zaid speaking, and he specifically says that he would write it down. It's reported in the same book on page 79. Al-Hakim reported in his book Al-Mustadrak on the authority of Zaid ibn Thabit, who said, we were with the messenger of Allah, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, compiling the Quran in pieces of cloth.
But for now, we just looked at that one and we asked the questions when it was written, and we quoted two scholars, 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐤𝐤 and 𝐸𝐵 Dr. 𝐸𝐵 and Dr. 𝐸𝐵, both from Turkey, who both had access to the Topkapi. They were the ones that were responsible for the Topkapi. They've had the best work on it, and they were the ones that came out with their report.
So this is J. Smith in August of 2018. He appeals to Dr. Tayar and Dr. Esangulu as scholars, and he pretends as if he uses their scholarship for his positions. But when I questioned him in March about their conclusions, he completely disregarded their research. He is not a scholar in the field. He does not do textual criticism. His PhD is on a biography of a Christian missionary in India. Let's just get that clear. So in August of 2018, he says, yes, I love these guys, they're great scholars. I use their research for my statements. But when I specifically questioned him on what their conclusions were, he rejected their scholarship. So which is it, Jay?
So Dr. Coolidge is saying it's the same. He points out orthographical differences, and based on your own scholarship, you disagree with his authority. Is that correct?
Listen, I'm going to disagree with him, obviously, because you're not going to hear what I'm saying. And listen to what I quote. When you look at the Topkapi is a mid-8th century man.
Hold on, Jay, let's work this out. Let's do simple math. 622 CE is when the Hijri calendar begins, agree?
Right. And goes to 719.
Hold on, add 50 years, what do you get?
And goes to 719.
Hold on, add 50 years, what do you get? You get 672.
So let's just clarify something here. We're trying to clarify the date from which the dating can begin. So the Turkish scholars wrote from the second half of the 1st century Hijra. So a century is 100 years. You split them up into 50 years to get two parts. The first 50 years are the earlier part, the second 50 years are the later part. The scholars are saying, these two Turkish scholars are saying that the dating begins from the second half of the 1st century. So we're looking at the year 622. This is the year that the Hijri calendar starts. You add 50 years to that, and that covers the first half of the 1st century. So 622, add 50 gives us 672, which means that the dating for the Topkapi manuscript begins, it's a range, it begins at 672. And then you add 50 years to that, and it takes you to the year 722. What J. Smith wants to avoid saying is that the date begins in the year 672. Why does he want to avoid that early date? Because that puts it within the 1st century Hijrah. You'll notice he also made another mistake, and that is, in the earlier version, he says it's mid-8th century. Mid-8th century will give us the year 750. Then he changes and he says, no, it's 719. That's a difference of almost 30 years. So in the same discussion I'm having with him, he gives me 2 different dates, drastically different dates, and he refuses to acknowledge that it can be within the year 670 onwards.
It goes to 719. It goes to 719. It goes to 719. The Topkapi is a mid-8th century man. It goes to 719. The Topkapi is a mid-8th century man. It goes to 719. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿 and 𝐬𝐮𝐬 both said that this was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. The end of the 7th century, the first half of the 8th century. It goes to 719. The Topkapi is a mid-8th century man. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. So basically, we're talking about the early 8th century up until the mid-8th century. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. So basically, we're talking about the early 8th century up until the mid-8th century. I know some Muslims would like to go to 670 and start with that date, but that's not what they're saying. You don't start with the earliest date, you start with the median date. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770.
We now begin our detailed analysis, and to do so we must first begin with some questions towards Mr. Smith. The first question is, where did Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿 or Dr. 𝐸𝐻𝑠𝑎𝑛𝑜ğlu mention a median date? I have looked at their manuscript, I have looked at the document itself, published in 2007, and I am unable at this point in time to find any mention of, or concept of a median date. So when you mention that this is not what the scholars say, then what do they say, and how do you make the claim that this median date comes with authority from them? We move to the second question. Where did anyone claim 670 was anything other than the start of the date range? I have always maintained and asked him why he always rejects or excludes the 7th century as part of the date range. And I have maintained that 50 years after the beginning of the Hijrah, which is the year 622, so we end up with the years between 670 to 672 as the start of the date range for which the Topkapi manuscript can be dated. And so I am asking Mr. Smith, where was any other claim than this made? Thirdly, I ask him, how did you get the date range of 720 to 750? This date range is not mentioned by any of the scholars, specifically not mentioned by Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿 or Dr. 𝐸𝐻𝑠𝑎𝑛𝑜ğlu. I have looked at their manuscript, by this I mean the document that they produced in 2007, and I am unable to find this date range. To examine Mr. Smith's date range, we are going to actually look at a comparison of the dates given by those scholars. And when we look at those dates, we come up with a very significant problem for Mr. Smith. The date range he has given is not evidenced by what the scholars themselves have said. It almost seems as if it's an arbitrary date to push the dating further away from the 1st century Hijrah. That means he is not giving us this date with pure objective intentions. It seems arbitrary, subjective, and biased. In order to do a detailed analysis, I've had to create a timeline, a chart with relevant dates being spoken of. That is to help us better visualize the data so that we can have a comprehensive understanding. Just to clarify here, the dates 620 and 622 are normally attributed to being the dates that the Hijri calendar begins at. For my purposes, I've previously published documents using the date 622, so I'm going to stick with that date. There are also a number of clarifications that need to be made. The dates I've given for Joseph J. Smith's claims, the date range that he has given, I started at the year 720 because in March he gave me the dates 719 and 720. And I've ended with his date range with the year 750 because in August he has claimed mid-8th century. So if he means any other date by the term mid-8th century, then that clarification is for him to make. But I've taken it as it is commonly understood. With those things said, let's look at this timeline. You'll notice that the timeline begins at the Roman year 600 and ends at the Roman year 800. I will explain how the Hijri or the Islamic calendar fits into this system. But just so that we understand it, we are looking at 2 centuries here. The year 600 to the year 700 is known as the 7th century, and the year 700 to the year 800 is known as the 8th century. I'm simplifying here, but you have to work with this given the graph in front of us. To continue, this would mean any date between the year 600 and 700 would fall into the 7th century. And so the Islamic calendar actually begins at the year 622. At the year 622, you have 100 years that takes us to the year 722. So 622, we begin with the Hijri calendar, and the first century of the Hijri calendar ends at the year 722. That's important. This means that the first century of the Hijri calendar spans some of the 7th century and some of the 8th century of the Roman calendar. This may confuse some people, but if you look closely at the chart for a period of time, it will eventually make sense to you. Again, to repeat, the Islamic first century, the first 100 years of the Islamic calendar, span from the year 622 in the 7th century to the year 722 in the 8th century. In addition to this, the year 722-723 to the year 822-823 takes us to the 2nd century of the Hijri calendar. This is also again very important because some of the information we will reference takes place in this 8th century of the Roman calendar. So what is peculiar here is that the only date that the scholars give, again, this is Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿 and Dr. 𝐸𝑠𝑎_NOGLU, the only date they actually give, the date range that they give using the Roman calendar, is the date range from the year 661 to the year 750. They don't use 670 and they don't use 770. So how J. Smith arrived at the date range ending at the year 770 cannot be explained by the scholarship that he appeals to. Again, the only date range that they give in terms of the Roman calendar that is specifically delineated are the years 661 to the year 750. Again, there's no mention of a median date by either Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿 or Dr. 𝐸𝑠𝑎_NOGLU. This is simply a manifestation of J. Smith's mind. Pursuant to his reasoning here, there is no reasonable way he ends at the year 720 for a median date. What I looked at when I looked at the only date range mentioned in the Roman calendar in their publication was from 661 to the year 750. The date range lands somewhere at the year 705 CE, that is of the Christian calendar, of the Roman calendar, so at the year 705. So even if there was a median date, and even if we accepted J's argument, then we still end up not at the year 720, but at the year 705. We also have another problem here for J. Smith, and that is Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿's words. He specifically says that the manuscript is not either 7th century or either 8th century. He doesn't say it's either 1st century Hijra or 2nd century Hijra. He says it's actually both. He says and. So he says it's the second half of the 1st century and the first half of the 2nd century. Now, why does he say this? He says this because there is some disputation as to whether or not the initial writer, the first copyist, was the same person to add the vowelins and dottins on the script. In Arabic, traditionally, you can write the script without vowelins and dottins. However, over time, some manuscripts were updated to include the vowelins and dottins, and this is quite normal. And so what we see here is that if someone later on came and added these vowelins and dottins later on, then the manuscript itself, based on just the consonantal skeletal text, that is the text without the vowels, would be definitively within the second half of the 1st century of the Hijra calendar, which is something that J. Smith does not want to seem to concede. With respect to the date range, there are a couple issues here, namely two. The first is the date range that Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿 gives in general terms is from the second half of the 1st century to the first half of the 2nd century. So generally a 100-year period following the year 670. So that brings us to the year 770. That's a 100-year period. Dr. 𝐸𝐤𝐤𝐿, he gives a date 661 to the year 750. That's a 89-year date range. So this would mean between the two scholars, they have given a date range somewhere between 89 and 100 years. That's the range that they're looking at. They don't tell you it's the year 670 it was written or the year 770. It's a date range, which is something that Smith does not seem to understand. He thinks that if they mention the year 670, that it must mean it's written in the year 670, or in the other case, if they mention the year 770, which they don't. But just given Smith's interpretation, if they mention the year 770, he thinks that the start and the end of the date ranges are the dates themselves. So that's completely incorrect. It's a date range, R-A-N-G-E, which means it spans a period of time. And so the scholarship has determined it's between an 89 and 100-year period that it possibly could be dated between. Now the problem with Smith is, let's take a look at this video clip.
So basically, we're talking about the early 8th century up until the mid 8th century.
In this video clip, he gives you early 8th century to mid 8th century, a 30-year period, 719 to the year 750. So how does he come up with a 31-year period? But scholarship, actual scholarship that have PhDs in this field and have looked at the evidence, they give you a date range of 89 years and 100 years. So it means to say that Smith is not following scholarship, but making up the numbers as he goes along. He treats the Quran as a copyist of the Bible would treat the Bible. Let us, however, take a moment to remind ourselves that the only actual dates given within the Roman calendar are the dates 661 to 750 by Dr. 𝐸𝐤𝐤𝐿. Those are the only dates given, delineated by the scholars. And we have already determined that if we had a quote-unquote median date, that would take us to the year 705. This would bring us to the end of today's video. I would like to thank everyone for watching, and most importantly, don't forget to visit our website 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐤𝐿.com, and I would also strongly like to encourage you to donate to Calling Christians. I've put the donation information in the video, and inshallah it should be in the description as well. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have. Thank you.